I noticed him the first morning I moved in, standing across the narrow street, arm raised in a slow, patient wave. His smile was gentle, almost practiced. Behind him, his house looked dark, hollow, like it hadn't been lived in for years. Every morning after that, the wave returned. Same time, same motion, same stillness in his posture. Curtains in his house never shifted. No lights ever came on. Yet he stood there, greeting me as if we shared a quiet routine. On the third day, I waved back without thinking. The relief I felt surprised me, like I'd passed an unspoken test. His smile widened slightly, then froze. He didn't lower his hand even after I stepped inside. That night, unpacking boxes, I realized something unsettling. I couldn't remember ever seeing him arrive or leave. No car, no footsteps, just the image of him already there, waiting, as if he'd been standing outside long before I noticed. My days settled into a predictable rhythm after that. I woke early, brewed cheap coffee, and stood by the front window while the kettle cooled. The street stayed quiet, familiar, almost comforting in its emptiness. I worked from home, editing audio late into the afternoon. Delivery bikes passed occasionally, their engines briefly breaking the stillness. Neighbors came and went, ordinary faces, ordinary routines. Nothing about the place felt unusual anymore. The house across from mine remained unchanged, its paint peeled in long, pale strips. The windows reflected the sky without revealing anything inside. I assumed it was unoccupied, another property waiting on paperwork or a distant owner. Sometimes I forgot about the man entirely until I caught movement through the glass. There he was, waving patiently, like a polite reminder that the morning had officially begun. I told myself he must live somewhere else nearby. Maybe he was visiting or caretaking the empty house. People had reasons that didn't need explaining, and I didn't feel entitled to his story. On weekends, I slept later. Even then, when I finally shuffled to the window, he was already there. The wave never rushed me. It waited, unbothered by my absence. Once, I stepped outside to check the mailbox while he stood across the street. The air smelled like dust and sun-warmed concrete. He didn't speak, just waved, smiling, eyes fixed on me. I nodded back, feeling faintly rude for not saying hello. His smile didn't change. No blink, no shift in weight. I told myself some people were simply odd, and odd wasn't dangerous. The rest of the day passed normally. Emails, lunch, the hum of my computer fan. The memory of his unmoving smile faded into the background noise of routine. By evening, I barely remembered him at all. The streetlights flickered on. His house stayed dark. I locked my door, feeling safe, unaware that the normalcy itself was already beginning to thin. The first thing that bothered me was the timing. I checked the clock one morning before looking outside. 6:42 a.m. When I turned my head, he was already waving, as if he'd known the exact second I would look. Another day, rain poured hard enough to blur the street. I almost missed him through the streaked glass. He stood uncovered, clothes dry, arm raised steadily, rain breaking around him like it didn't apply. I started noticing his clothes never changed. Same faded shirt, same dark trousers, same soft bend at the elbow. Days passed. Weather shifted. He remained identical, like a repeated frame. One afternoon, I watched longer than usual. My arm dropped after a few seconds, but it stayed up. Minutes went by. My coffee cooled. His smile never faltered, never trembled. I waved again, slower this time, testing something I couldn't name. He didn't respond differently. The wave wasn't a greeting, I realized. It was a position he held. That evening, I mentioned him casually to a neighbor while taking out trash. She followed my gaze across the street, squinting at the empty house, then looked back at me, confused. "There's nobody there," she said, not dismissive, just certain. I laughed it off too quickly, blaming distance, angles, bad light. She shrugged and wished me a good night. Later, I stood by the window after dark. The street lamp buzzed softly. The house across the way was a black shape. For a moment, I felt foolishly relieved that he was gone. Then the lamp flickered brighter, and I saw him again. Still waving, still smiling. Lit from below now, his face looked wrong in a way I couldn't describe. I went to bed uneasy, replaying the image. I told myself exhaustion could invent details, stretch shadows. But sleep didn't come easily, and when it did, I dreamed of arms that never lowered. By morning, my fear felt exaggerated. I told myself stress does strange things to perception. Working alone too much, staring out the same window, letting patterns form where none existed seemed far more reasonable than anything else. I searched online for explanations that sounded boring enough to be true. Muscle memory, habitual gestures, people with fixed routines. The more mundane the possibility, the calmer I felt accepting it. The house, I reasoned, might not be empty at all. Lights off during the day meant nothing. Curtains drawn for privacy. Plenty of people preferred stillness, especially older men with time. I forced myself to stop watching him. If I didn't look, I couldn't misinterpret. I rearranged my desk away from the window and kept the blinds half closed most days. When I did catch glimpses, I trained myself to see him differently. A neighbor waiting for someone. A man with nowhere urgent to be. Nothing about that required fear really. I even practiced smiling back without thinking, casual and brief. If this was a misunderstanding, I didn't want to escalate it in my own head by acting suspicious or strange. Friends on the phone sounded unconcerned when I mentioned him. Old neighborhoods had their fixtures, they said. Familiar oddities you stopped noticing once they blended into daily life eventually anyway. I laughed along, grateful for their certainty. It was easier borrowing someone else's confidence than sitting alone with my doubts, letting them grow teeth and wait inside my thoughts overnight. That night, I slept with the blinds fully closed. No checking, no confirming. I told myself that whatever I couldn't see couldn't unsettle me the way it had before yesterday. But as I lay there, listening to the house settle, I still pictured that raised arm. Not menacing, just patient, waiting for me to look again in the morning light. On Monday, I opened the blinds later than usual, deliberately delaying the moment. The street was empty at first, and relief loosened my chest. Then, as if summoned by my attention, his arm lifted into view. Tuesday, I looked early, before sunrise. He was already there, shape barely formed in the gray light, waving toward a darkened window. It felt less like coincidence and more like alignment. By Wednesday, I noticed the wave changed only when I did. If I stood longer, it continued longer. If I stepped back, it never stopped, just waited, held in place. I tested it carefully, feeling ridiculous. I waved twice. He did not mirror me. I stopped midway. His arms stayed raised, unchanged, like the gesture existed independently of intention itself. Thursday morning, I stayed away from the window entirely. When I finally glanced outside near noon, he was still there, arm lifted, smile intact, as if the morning had never ended. The pattern tightened. No matter the hour, no matter the weather, the wave existed only for me. Delivery drivers passed without pause. Neighbors walked by without acknowledgement. No one looked twice. I began tracking it unintentionally, noting times, light, my own movements. The more attention I paid, the more consistent it became, like something settling into a rule it preferred there. One evening, I watched from behind the curtain. The moment my eyes aligned with him, his smile deepened slightly. It was subtle, but it felt responsive in a way I hadn't seen before. I stepped aside quickly, heart ticking faster. The wave continued outside my view. I could sense it, absurdly, like pressure behind my eyes, insisting on being acknowledged by me alone. From then on, the wave appeared only after I noticed it was absent. Absence became the cue. My attention felt less like observation and more like participation in it fully. I tried breaking the pattern by leaving early, returning late, changing routines. Each time, when I finally looked, he was there, unchanged, ready, as though time bent around that single gesture. By the end of the week, the wave no longer felt repetitive. It felt deliberate. Not a habit, not a quirk. A signal that required my presence to complete it. The first personal detail I noticed was my reflection. One morning, his eyes didn't seem fixed on my window, but slightly lower, aligned with where I stood behind the glass. When I shifted, the focus shifted too. I tested it by crouching slowly. My knees ached as I lowered myself. His gaze followed, smile stretching just enough to acknowledge the movement. The wave never changed, but the attention did. After that, I couldn't unsee it. He wasn't greeting the house. He was greeting me. My exact position, my height, my pauses. The realization made the room feel smaller, tighter. I stopped waving back entirely. Days passed without response from me, yet the wave continued, unwavering. If anything, the patience behind it felt heavier, like a held breath. One afternoon, I worked from my bedroom instead of the living room. When I finally checked outside, he had shifted slightly to the left, just enough to remain visible from my new angle. That night, I dreamed of standing across the street myself, arm raised, smiling until my face hurt. I woke with my shoulder aching, fingers tingling like they'd been clenched too long. The next morning, his hand was higher than usual. Not much, just enough that I noticed. My shoulder throbbed in dull agreement, an echo I couldn't explain away. I started feeling watched even when I wasn't near the window. In the kitchen, in the shower. The sense didn't come from outside exactly, but from a fixed point in my awareness. I avoided mirrors. When I passed reflective surfaces, I expected to see my arm lifted without my permission. I kept my hands in my pockets like that might prevent something spreading. Once, while brushing my teeth, I caught myself smiling unconsciously. The expression felt wrong on my face, borrowed. I dropped the toothbrush, heart racing, and forced my mouth flat again. The wave no longer waited for my mornings. It followed me into thought. I'd picture it mid-task, and the image arrived fully formed, precise, like a memory being refreshed repeatedly. By then, I understood something I didn't want to admit. Whatever stood across the street didn't need the house. It didn't even need the street. It needed me looking back. I tried telling people again, more carefully this time. I described patterns instead of fear, details instead of feelings. Their faces tightened politely, eyes drifting the way they do when concern turns into something else. One friend stood at my window with me, arms crossed, waiting. The street stayed empty. The house across from mine looked abandoned, harmless. When she left, she avoided meeting my eyes. I stopped inviting anyone over after that. Their presence disrupted nothing. The wave didn't appear for them, and explaining why it mattered made me sound unstable even to myself. The neighbor who'd spoken to me before began crossing the street when she saw me outside. She smiled stiffly, hurried past, never once looking where I pointed instinctively. I considered calling someone official. Police, housing authority, anyone. But how do you report a man who only exists when you look, who commits no act except greeting you? The days grew quieter. I kept the blinds closed, lights low, living inwardly. Even then, I felt the wave continuing somewhere, suspended, patient, waiting for me to confirm it. Sleep fractured. I woke often, convinced my arm was lifting on its own. I slept with my hands tucked under my legs, pressing them numb just to feel certain they hadn't moved. Messages went unanswered longer. I didn't have the energy to pretend normalcy, while something so precise unraveled me slowly. Silence became easier than defending my reality. One evening, the power went out. Darkness filled the room, thick and absolute. Without thinking, I moved toward the window, drawn by habit more than curiosity. In the faint glow of a distant street lamp, I saw him clearly, closer than before, still across the street, but occupying more of my vision than distance should allow. No house framed him anymore, just open space behind, stretching flat and wrong. His wave continued, tireless, and for the first time, I realized no one else was ever going to see him. I crossed the street the next morning without planning to. The air felt thin, unreal, like I'd already committed to something irreversible. Standing before the empty house, I felt no resistance, only recognition, like arriving late to myself. The front door wasn't locked. Inside, dust lay untouched, furniture outlines faint on the floor. No signs of life, no smell of recent presence. Yet the space felt occupied, attentive, as though it expected me. In the hallway mirror, I paused. My reflection smiled before I did. My arm lifted slightly, testing weight, position, memory. The gesture felt familiar in a way that bypassed thought entirely. I found photographs in a back room, scattered on the floor. Each showed the same street, the same window, the same man waving. In every image, the man was me, standing where I always stood. The dates on the photos stretched back years, long before I'd moved in. In some, the house behind me was clearly empty. In others, faintly lit, like someone had just stepped away. When I returned to my side of the street, the window reflected nothing. No movement, no watcher. Across from me, in the glass, I saw myself already there, arm raised, smiling patiently, waiting for me to look. I don't wave anymore. I hold the position. Morning light comes and goes while my arm stays raised, muscles burning until the sensation fades into something dull and manageable. People pass without noticing. They always have. From here, the street looks unchanged, peaceful even. My house across the way appears empty now, windows dark, waiting on someone new. Sometimes I feel a pull, like a tension brushing against me from behind the glass. When it happens, my smile deepens on its own, gentle and reassuring, practiced through repetition. I don't know how long I've been standing here. Time feels circular now, but I know one thing with certainty. When someone finally looks up, I will already be waving.